Seattle Atheist Church, because good works in non-mysterious ways.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you, and I'm glad you could make it. This is one of those talks where I've had to restrain myself regarding how much of the great text of the original post to share with you. I'm not going to be able to share with you the bit about Lovecraft's short story about Barzai the Wise and the other gods, or the bit about the cult of Cthulhu, or the bit about how evolution is a blind, idiot, alien god that optimizes for stupid things and has no concern with human value, or the bit about Gnon, the acronym for nature and nature's God, or the bit about gotcha, the gods of the copyright headings, or the bit where Scott Alexander updates his analysis to take technological progress into account, including superintelligent AI, which of course is a huge part of this essay. I can't even share with you the bit about how memes fit into all this. And if you were here for my talk on memes, aka mind viruses, you know how interesting I think memes are. Indeed, I've had to reduce the scope of what I present to you today to basically just introducing the concept of Moloch and touching on a few examples and a bit of commentary. As much as it pains me to leave so much astute analysis, profound pondering, and excellent examples on the cutting room floor, I take solace in the knowledge that what remains will be more than enough to prompt a wide-ranging and thoughtful discussion. And I'll post a link to the full text in the chat and on Discord later. So now let's indulge in some meditations on Moloch. Oh, and just real quick, apparently Moloch is also some conspiracy thing that Alex Jones rants about from time to time. I don't really know what he's on about, and this has nothing to do with that. If you've never heard about that and weren't wondering if this was related, just forget I mentioned it. Oh, and another thing, all deities discussed here are literally metaphors. Neither Scott Alexander nor I think they're actually real. So don't worry, I'm not promoting anything supernatural from the podium here. We begin with Allen Ginsberg's famous poem about Moloch. It's the second part of a larger three-part poem called Howl, published in 1956, and it's considered to be one of the great works of American literature. In fact, while putting this talk together, I discovered that it was made into a movie in 2010 starring James Franco as Allen Ginsberg. Instead of reading the poem myself, I figured I'd let the master read it to you. Unfortunately, the best version on YouTube doesn't have subtitles. If you'd like to read along, you can find the text of the poem at this link that I will paste in chat. There we go. To find the part about Moloch, just scroll down to the Roman numeral 2 and you'll find it. All right, share screen.
What sphinx of cement and aluminum bashed open their skulls and ate up their brains and imagination? Moloch, solitude, filth, ugliness, ash cans and unobtainable dollars, children screaming under stairways, boys sobbing in armies, old men weeping in the parks. Moloch, Moloch, nightmare of Moloch, Moloch the loveless, mental Moloch, Moloch the heavy judger of men, Moloch the incomprehensible prison, Moloch the cross-bones, soulless jailhouse and congress of sorrows, Moloch whose buildings are judgment, Moloch the vast stone of war, Moloch the stunned government, Moloch whose mind is pure machinery, Moloch whose blood is running money, Moloch whose fingers are 10 armies, Moloch whose breast is a cannibal dynamo, Moloch whose ear is a smoking tomb, Moloch whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows, Moloch, whose skyscrapers stand in the long streets like endless Jehovahs. Moloch, whose factories dream and croak in the fog. Moloch, whose smokestacks and antennae crown the cities. Moloch, whose love is endless oil and stone. Moloch, whose soul is electricity and banks. Moloch, whose poverty is the specter of genius. Moloch, whose fate is a cloud of sexless hydrogen. Moloch, whose name is the mind. Moloch, in whom I sit lonely. Moloch, in whom I dream angels. Crazy in Moloch, cocksucker in Moloch, lack-love and manless in Moloch. Moloch, who entered my soul early. Moloch, in whom I am a consciousness without a body. Moloch, who frightened me out of my natural ecstasy. Moloch, whom I abandon. Wake up in Moloch, light streaming out of the sky. Moloch, Moloch, robot apartments, invisible suburbs, skeleton treasuries, blind capitals, demonic industries, spectral nations, invincible madhouses, granite cocks, monstrous bombs. They broke their backs lifting Moloch to heaven. Pavements, trees, radios, tons, lifting the city to heaven which exists and is everywhere about us. Visions, omens, hallucinations, miracles, ecstasies, gone down the American river. Dreams, adorations, illuminations, religions, the whole boatload of sensitive bullshit. Breakthroughs over the river, flips and crucifixions gone down the flood, highs, epiphanies, despairs, 10 years animal screams and suicides, minds, new loves, mad generation, down on the rocks of time. Real holy laughter in the river. They saw it all. The wild eyes, the holy yells. They bade farewell. They jumped off the roof to solitude, waving, carrying flowers down to the river, into the street.
What's always impressed Scott Alexander about this poem is its conception of civilization as an individual entity. You can almost see him with his fingers of armies and his skyscraper window eyes. A lot of the commentators say Moloch represents capitalism. This is definitely a piece of it, perhaps even a big piece, but it doesn't quite fit. Capitalism, whose fate is a cloud of sexless hydrogen? Capitalism, in whom I am a consciousness without a body? Capitalism, therefore, granite cocks? Moloch is introduced as the answer to a question. C.S. Lewis's question in Hierarchy of Philosophers. What does it? Earth could be fair and all men glad and wise. Instead, we have prisons, smokestacks, asylums. What sphinx of cement and aluminum breaks open their skulls and eats up their imagination? And Ginsberg answers, Moloch does it. There's a passage in the Principia Discordia where the character Molochalypse complains to the goddess about the evils of human society. Everyone is hurting each other. The planet is rampant with injustices. Whole societies plunder groups of their own people. Mothers imprison sons. Children perish while brothers war. The goddess answers, what's the matter with that if that's what you want to do? Molochalypse, but nobody wants it. Everybody hates it. The goddess, oh, well, then stop. The implicit question is, if everyone hates the current system, who perpetuates it? And Ginsberg answers, Moloch. It's powerful not because it's correct, nobody literally thinks an ancient Carthaginian demon causes everything, but because thinking of the system as an agent throws into relief the degree to which the system isn't an agent. Nick Bostrom makes an offhanded reference to the possibility of a dictatorless dystopia, one that every single citizen, including the leadership, hates, but which, nevertheless, endures unconquered. It's easy to imagine such a state. Imagine a country with two rules. First, every person must spend 8 hours a day giving themselves strong electric shocks. Second, if anyone fails to follow a rule, including this one, or speaks out against it, or fails to enforce it, all citizens must unite to kill that person. Suppose these rules were well enough established by tradition that everyone expects them to be enforced. So, you shock yourself for 8 hours a day, because you know that if you don't, everyone else will kill you, because if they don't, everyone else will kill them, and so on. Every single citizen hates the system, but for lack of a good coordination mechanism, it endures. From a God's eye view, we can optimize the system to everyone agrees to stop doing this at once. But no one within the system is able to effect the transition without great risk to themselves. And okay, this example is kind of contrived. So let's run through, let's say, 10 real-world examples of similar multipolar traps to really hammer in how important it is. Just kidding. We'll only have time to touch on a few of the examples that Scott provides. And by the way, he cheated and actually gave 14. Our first example is the prisoner's dilemma, as played by two very dumb libertarians who keep ending up on defect. There's a much better outcome available if they could figure out the coordination, but coordination is hard. From a God's eye view, we can agree that cooperate is a better outcome than defect, but neither prisoner within the system can make it happen. Our next example is the Malthusian trap, at least at its extremely pure theoretical limits. Suppose you're one of the first rats introduced onto a pristine island. It's full of yummy plants, and you live an idyllic life, lounging about, eating, and composing great works of art. You're one of those rats from the Rats of Nim. You live a long life, mate, and have a dozen children. All of them have a dozen children, and so on. In a couple generations, the island has 10,000 rats and has reached its carrying capacity. Now there's not enough food and space to go around, and a certain percent of each new generation dies in order to keep the population steady at 10,000. A certain sect of rats abandons art in order to devote more of their time to scrounging for survival. Each generation, a bit less of this sect dies than members of the mainstream, and after a while, no rat composes any art at all, and any sect of rats who try to bring it back will go extinct within a few generations. In fact, it's not just art. Any sect at all that is leaner, meaner, and more survivalist than the mainstream will eventually take over. If one sect of rats altruistically decides to limit its offspring to 2 per couple in order to decrease overpopulation, that sect will die out, swarmed out of existence by its more numerous enemies. If one sect of rats starts practicing cannibalism and finds it gives them an advantage over their fellows, it will eventually take over and reach fixation. If some rat scientists predict that that depletion of the island's nut stores is accelerating at a dangerous rate, and they will soon be exhausted completely, a few sects of rats might try to limit their nut consumption to a sustainable level. Those rats will be outcompeted by their more selfish cousins. Eventually, the nuts will be exhausted, and most of the rats will die off, and the cycle will begin again. Any sect of rats advocating some action to stop the cycle will be outcompeted by their cousins, for whom advocating anything is a waste of time that could be used to compete and consume. For a bunch of reasons, evolution is not quite as Malthusian as this ideal case, but it provides a prototype example we can apply to other things to see the underlying mechanism. From a God's eye view, it's easy to say the rats should maintain a comfortably low population. From within the system, each individual rat will follow its genetic imperative, and the island will end up in an endless boom-bust cycle. Our next example is capitalism. Imagine a capitalist in a cutthroat industry. He employs workers in a sweatshop to sew garments, which he sells at minimal profit. Maybe he would like to pay his workers more or give them nicer working conditions, but he can't, because that would raise the price of his products and he would be outcompeted by his cheaper rivals and go bankrupt. Maybe many of his rivals are nice people who would also like to pay their workers more, but unless they have some kind of ironclad guarantee that none of them are going to defect by undercutting their prices, they can't do it. Like the rats who gradually lose all values except sheer competition, so companies in an economic environment of sufficiently intense competition are forced to abandon all values except optimization for profit, or else be outcompeted by companies that optimize for profit better, and so can sell the same service at a lower price. I'm not really sure how widely people appreciate the value of analogizing capitalism to evolution. Fit companies, defined as those who make the customer want to buy from them, survive, expand, and inspire future efforts. And unfit companies, defined as those no one wants to buy from, go bankrupt and die out along with their company DNA. The reasons nature is red in tooth and claw are the same reasons the market is ruthless and exploitative. From a God's eye view, we can contrive a friendly industry where every company pays its workers a living wage. From within the system, there's no way to enact it. Moloch, whose love is endless oil and stone. Moloch, whose blood is running money. Our final example is the race to the bottom, which describes a political situation where some jurisdictions lure businesses by promising lower taxes and fewer regulations. The end result is that either everyone is for competitiveness by having minimal tax rates and regulations, or they lose all of their business, revenue, and jobs to jurisdictions who did, at which point they are pushed out and replaced by a government who will be more compliant. But even though this last one has stolen the name, all these scenarios are, in fact, a race to the bottom. A basic principle unites all of these multipolar traps. In some competition optimizing for X, the opportunity arises to throw some other value under the bus for improved X. Those who take it prosper. Those who don't take it die out. Eventually, everyone's relative status is about the same as before, but everyone's absolute status is worse than before. The process continues until all other values that can be traded off have been. In other words, until human ingenuity cannot possibly figure out a way to make things any worse. Any human with above room temperature IQ can design a utopia, though a lot of utopias sweep the hard problems under the rug or would fall apart in 10 minutes if actually implemented. The reason our current system isn't a utopia is that it wasn't designed by humans. Just as you can look at an arid terrain and determine what shape a river will take one day by assuming water will obey gravity, so you can look at a civilization and determine what shape its institutions will one day take by assuming people will obey incentives. But that means that just as the shapes of rivers are not designed for beauty or navigation, but rather are an artifact of randomly determined terrain, so institutions will not be designed for prosperity or justice, but rather will be an artifact of randomly determined initial conditions. Just as people can level terrain and build canals, so people can alter the incentive landscape in order to build better institutions. But they can only do so when they are incentivized to do so, which is not always. As a result, some pretty wild tributaries and rapids form in some very strange places. The Apocrypha Discordia says, "Time flows like a river," which is to say, downhill. We can tell this because everything is going downhill rapidly. It would seem prudent to be somewhere else when we reach the sea. Let's take this random gag 100% literally and see where it leads us. We just analogized the flow of incentives to the flow of a river. The downhill trajectory is appropriate. The traps happen when you find an opportunity to trade off a useful value for greater competitiveness. Once everyone has it, the greater competitiveness brings you no joy, but the value is lost forever. Therefore, each step of the poor coordination polka makes your life worse. But not only have we not yet reached the sea, but we also seem to move uphill surprisingly often. Why do things not degenerate more and more until we're back at subsistence level? I can think of 3 bad reasons: excess resources, physical limitations, and utility maximization, plus 1 good reason: coordination. First, let's talk about excess resources. The ocean depths are a horrible place with little light, few resources, and various horrible organisms dedicated to eating or parasitizing one another. But every so often, a whale carcass falls to the bottom of the sea. More food than the organisms that find it could ever possibly want. There's a brief period of miraculous plenty, while the couple of creatures that first encounter the whale feed like kings. Eventually, more animals discover the carcass. The faster breeding animals in the carcass multiply, the whale is gradually consumed, and everyone sighs and goes back to living in a Malthusian death trap. It's as if a group of those rats who had abandoned art and turned to cannibalism suddenly was blown away to a new empty island with much higher carrying capacity, where they could once again have the breathing room to live in peace and create artistic masterpieces. This is the age of whalefall, an age of excess carrying capacity, an age when we suddenly find ourselves with a 1,000-mile head start on Malthus. As Robin Hanson puts it, this is the dream time. As long as resources aren't scarce enough to lock us into a war of all against all, we can do silly, non-optimal things like art and music and philosophy and love, and not be outcompeted by merciless killing machines most of the time. Next, let's talk about physical limitations. Imagine a profit-maximizing slave master who decides to cut costs by, well, I'm going to go ahead and skip the details and summarize it as simply, the body has certain physical limitations that limit how mean you can get away with being. So in this case, a race to the bottom where competing plantations become crueler and crueler to their slaves in order to maximize competitiveness is halted by the physical limitation of cruelty not helping after a certain point. Now let's talk about the last bad reason, utility maximization. We've been thinking in terms of preserving values versus winning competitions, and expecting optimizing for the latter to destroy the former. But many of the most important competition/optimization processes in modern civilization are optimizing for human values. You win at capitalism partly by satisfying customers' values. You win at democracy partly by satisfying voters' values. Suppose there's a coffee plantation somewhere in Ethiopia that employs Ethiopians to grow coffee beans that get sold to the United States. Maybe it's locked in a life and death struggle with other coffee plantations and wants to throw as many values under the bus as it can to pick up a slight advantage. But it can't sacrifice the quality of coffee produced too much, or else the Americans won't buy it. And it can't sacrifice wages or working conditions too much, or else the Ethiopians won't work there. And in fact, part of its competition optimization process is finding the best ways to attract workers and customers that it can, as long as it doesn't cost them too much money. So this is very promising. But it's important to remember exactly how fragile this beneficial equilibrium is. Suppose the coffee plantations discover a toxic pesticide that will increase their yield, but make their customers sick. But their customers don't know about the pesticide, and the government hasn't caught up to regulating it yet. Now there's a tiny uncoupling between selling to Americans and satisfying Americans' values. And so, of course, Americans' values get thrown under the bus. Or suppose there's a baby boom in Ethiopia, and suddenly there are 5 workers competing for each job. Now, the company can afford to lower wages and implement cruel working conditions down to whatever the physical limits are. As soon as there's an uncoupling between getting Ethiopians to work here and satisfying Ethiopian values, it doesn't look too good for Ethiopian values either. Or suppose someone invents a robot that can pick coffee better and cheaper than a human. The company fires all of its laborers and throws them onto the street. As soon as the utility of the Ethiopians is no longer necessary for profit, all pressure to maintain it disappears. Or suppose that there is some important value that is neither a value of the employees nor the customers. Maybe the coffee plantations are on the habitat of a rare tropical bird that environmentalist groups want to protect. Maybe they're on the ancestral burial ground of a tribe different from the one the plantation is employing, and they want it respected in some way. Maybe coffee growing contributes to global warming somehow. As long as it's not a value that will prevent the average American from buying from them or the average Ethiopian from working for them, under the bus it goes. I know that capitalists sometimes do bad things isn't exactly an original talking point. But I do want to stress how it's not equivalent to capitalists are greedy. I mean, sometimes they are, but other times they're just in a sufficiently intense competition where anyone who doesn't do it will be outcompeted and replaced by people who do. Business practices are set by Moloch. No one else has any choice in the matter. From my very little knowledge of Marx, he understands this very, very well, and people who summarize him as capitalists are greedy are doing him a disservice. And as well understood as the capitalist example is, I think it's less well appreciated that democracy has the same problems. Yes, in theory, it's optimizing for voter happiness, which correlates with good policy making. But as soon as there's the slightest disconnect between good policy making and electability, good policy making has to get thrown under the bus. For example, ever-increasing prison terms are unfair to inmates and unfair to the society that has to pay for them. Politicians are unwilling to do anything about them because they don't want to look soft on crime. And if a single inmate whom they helped release ever does anything bad, and statistically one of them will have to, it'll be all over the airwaves as convict released by congressman's policies kills family of 5. How can the congressman even sleep at night, let alone claim he deserves re-election? So even if decreasing prison populations would be good policy, and it is, it will be very difficult to implement. Moloch, the incomprehensible prison. Moloch, the crossbones, soulless jailhouse and congress of sorrows. Moloch, whose buildings are judgment. Moloch, the stunned governments. Turning satisfying customers and satisfying citizens into the outputs of optimization processes was one of civilization's greatest advances, and the reason why capitalist democracies have so outperformed other systems. But if we have bound Moloch as our servant, the bonds are not very strong, and we sometimes find that the tasks he has done for us move to his advantage rather than ours. Finally, let's talk about one good reason: coordination. The opposite of a trap is a garden. Things are easy to solve from a God's eye view. So if everyone comes together into a superorganism, that superorganism can solve problems with ease and finesse. An intense competition between agents has turned into a garden, with a single gardener dictating where everything should go and removing elements that don't conform to the pattern. The best known solution to the prisoner's dilemma is for the mob boss to threaten to shoot any prisoner who defects. The solution to companies polluting and harming workers is government regulations against such. Governments solve arms races within a country by maintaining a monopoly on the use of force. And it's easy to see that if a truly effective world government ever arose, international military buildups would end pretty quickly. The two active ingredients of government are laws plus violence, or more abstractly, agreements plus enforcement mechanism. Many other things besides governments share these two active ingredients, and so are able to act as coordination mechanisms to avoid traps. Social codes, gentlemen's agreements, industrial guilds, criminal organizations, traditions, friendships, schools, corporations, and religions are all coordinating institutions that keep us out of traps by changing our incentives. But these institutions not only incentivize others, but are themselves incentivized. These are large organizations made up of lots of people who are competing for jobs, status, prestige, etc. There's no reason they should be immune to the same multipolar traps as everyone else. And indeed, they aren't. Governments can, in theory, keep corporations, citizens, etc., out of certain traps. But as we saw above, there are many traps that governments themselves can fall into. The United States tries to solve the problem by having multiple levels of government, unbreakable constitutional laws, checks and balances between different branches, and a couple of other hacks. Saudi Arabia uses a different tactic. They just put one guy in charge of everything. This is the much maligned, Scott thinks unfairly, argument in favor of monarchy. A monarch is an incentivized incentivizer. He actually has the God's eye view and is outside of and above every system. He has permanently won all competitions and is not competing for anything, and therefore he is perfectly free of Moloch and of the incentives that would otherwise channel his incentives into predetermined paths. Aside from a few very theoretical proposals, monarchy is the only system that does this. But then, instead of following a random incentive structure, we're following the whims of one guy. Caesar's palace, hotel, and casino is a crazy waste of resources, but the actual Julius Caesar wasn't exactly the perfect, benevolent, rational central planner either. The libertarian authoritarian axis on the political compass is a trade-off between discoordination and tyranny. You can have everything perfectly coordinated by someone with a God's eye view, but then he risks Stalin. And you can be totally free of all central authority, but then you're stuck in every stupid multipolar trap that Moloch can devise. The libertarians make a convincing argument for one side, the monarchists for the other. But I expect that, like most trade-offs, we just have to hold our noses and admit that it's a really hard problem. The opposite of a trap is a garden. The only way to avoid having all human values gradually ground down by optimization competition is to install a gardener over the entire universe who optimizes for human values. And the whole point of Nick Bostrom's superintelligence is that this is within our reach. Once humans can design machines that are smarter than we are, by definition, they'll be able to design machines which are smarter than they are, which can design machines that are smarter than they are, and so on, in a feedback loop so tiny that it will smash up against the physical limitations for intelligence in a comparatively lightning short amount of time. The sheer speed of the cycle makes it possible that we will end up with one entity light years ahead of the rest of civilization, so much so that it can suppress any competition, including competition for its title of most powerful entity, permanently. In the very near future, we are going to lift something to heaven. It might be Moloch, but it might be something on our side. If it's on our side, it can kill Moloch dead. Bertrand Russell said, "One should respect public opinion insofar as it is necessary to avoid starvation and keep out of prison. But anything that goes beyond this is voluntary submission to an unnecessary tyranny." So be it with Moloch. Our job is to placate him insofar as it is necessary to avoid starvation and invasion. And that only for a short time, until we come into our full power. The question everyone has after reading Ginsberg is, what is Moloch? My answer is, Moloch is exactly what the history books say he is. He is the god of child sacrifice, the fiery furnace into which you can toss your babies in exchange for victory in war. He always and everywhere offers the same deal. Throw what you love most into the flames, and I can grant you power. As long as the offer's open, it will be irresistible. So we need to close the offer. Only another god can kill Moloch. We might soon have one on our side, but it needs our help. Ginsberg's poem famously begins, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness." I'm luckier than Ginsberg. I got to see the best minds of my generation identify a problem and get to work. And that's where I'll leave it for today.